Buckingham Palace, one of the most famous buildings in the world, a symbol of Britain, the scene of countless royal celebrations, romances and tragedies.
No one who knew Diana will ever forget her.
This is a closed and secretive world. Now we reveal what really happens behind its grand exterior. We discover how shocking security threatened royal lives.
She knew that she was fighting for her life.
We expose palace tensions as far back as the 1950s.
You might almost say that the royal marriage was on the rocks.
How the palace became a family battleground.
It was a vicious, brutal civil war.
And how the palace opened up as never before.
For a moment, there was such a great feeling in the country. It was like, yes, we did this and we have come together.
In this programme, we look back over the 60 tumultuous years since the Queen's coronation and look ahead to the next monarch.
There are many people around Charles who say that he does not want to move in there.
We ask, what might the future hold for Buckingham Palace? Buckingham Palace is a world of its own. No other building on earth combines being a family home, the office of the head of state, and a magnificent stage for pomp and ceremony. It's made the palace the most important symbol of Britain and the royal family.
It's become so synonymous with the monarch, both in Britain and worldwide, that actually to many people, Buckingham Palace is the monarchy.
But this building has only been a palace for less than 200 years. It was in 1837 that Queen Victoria became the first monarch to call it home. But after Albert's early death, she moved out to hide away at Windsor and Balmoral. Buckingham Palace was more or less abandoned. Victoria's lengthy withdrawal from public life led many to question whether Britain needed a monarchy at all. But in 1901, her son, Edward VII, came to the throne. Determined to revive royal fortunes, he saw Buckingham Palace as the key. He turned a run-down building into a grand regal stage. His successor, George V, finished the job. His public devotion to duty meant king and palace were back in favour. After the Second World War, it became the place to gather in times of crisis or celebration. In 1952, a new young queen, just 25 years old, moved into the palace. Elizabeth's reign was seen as a fresh start after the dark days of war, and her coronation would be the event to mark that. Inside the palace, her officials set about organising it in the time-honoured fashion. But with plans well underway, they were confronted with a shocking demand. The BBC wanted to televise the ceremony, and not only that, they wanted to show it live.
To the palace, the idea of televising the coronation is anathema. It's a private ceremony, and the palace are very concerned that people will be watching in a disrespectful manner. They'll have their hats on, they'll be drinking tea, they'll be drinking alcohol, they might be shouting.
The Queen's aides were men who had served her father and grandfather. They didn't like change.
There was a great gulf fixed between the stuffy old courtiers, the life that they led inside Buckingham Palace, and the life of the people as it was beginning to change, as it was affected by the war.
The young Queen was surrounded by elderly churchmen and middle-aged aristocrats, often with military backgrounds.
These courtiers run the royal family. They tell the royal family what to do. They believe they know better than the royals themselves how royals should behave, and they don't hesitate to say so.
And the palace courtiers told the BBC there would be no live television. But the old-fashioned officials were out of touch with the country. The nation was up in arms.
The people, the newspapers, everyone said, no, We want to see our Queen. It's not fair. And a lot of the newspapers got very pointed in their criticism.
Alarmed by the public anger, the Queen herself stepped in. She stood up to her advisers and said yes to the broadcast. But for a palace still recovering from the hardships of war, organising a grand royal ceremony was a stretch.
Once the palace realised that the coronation was going to be televised, they thought, this has got to be a big spectacle, and they realised that what they had wasn't big enough.
The royal carriages had been, shortly before it all happened, they'd been sold off, and they had to be got back.
What they had to do was they had to draft in all types of servants from aristocratic houses all over the country and dress them up as footmen and coachmen and put them on the coaches to make it look like the great big grand coronation of the Queen of a huge empire.
Who comes there?
Her Majesty's officers of arms.
This was the nation coming together in a genuine act of communion with the sovereign at its centre and with Buckingham Palace as the backcloth of this splendid pageantry.
But only weeks after the coronation, life inside the palace was badly disrupted. Royal aides were furious when newspapers broke the story of a scandalous royal romance. Behind the palace walls, an illicit affair had been brewing involving the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret, and a palace servant.
Peter Townsend was a war hero. He was very good looking. He had enormous charm. I met him once and I thought, wow.
But Group Captain Peter Townsend was staff. He was an assistant, first to Margaret's father, then her mother. His job was to keep the family happy, not to fall in love with the princess.
Princess Margaret saw Peter Townsend almost constantly. He was always at the palace. The king liked having him round. And there is this incredibly good-looking, nice man who adores you and your family, who you're with the whole time, who the king gets to escort you to a dance or to the theatre. Propinquity does its work. It's very difficult not to fall for them.
Senior royals inside the palace had hoped the relationship was just a teenage crush.
The Queen Mother, she had this knack of, if she didn't want to know something, she didn't know it. I think she was just determined to shut her eyes to what was going on.
But the palace romance was getting serious. Margaret and Townsend were not short of opportunity. Margaret had a suite of rooms on the second floor of Buckingham Palace overlooking the Mall. Townsend had a room in the household quarters downstairs in the south wing. In 1953, the affair turned into a full-blown royal crisis when Townsend and Margaret announced they wanted to marry. This time, the Queen sided with her advisers. The problem was not just that he was a servant, it was worse. He was divorced. Any royal who married a divorcee would be forced to give up their right of succession. But the Queen and her advisers, there were scandalous echoes of Edward VIII's affair with divorcee Wallis Simpson. The Queen asked her private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, to sort out the mess.
Tommy Lascelles was an arrogant man, a smug man, an old-school aristocrat who thought he knew the answer to everything.
Lascelles was determined to bury the relationship. He separated the pair in the hope the affair would fizzle out, and Townsend was sent away from the palace. Behind the palace walls, the mood was grim. Lascelles worked on Margaret. Divorce was not allowed in the royal family. If she married Townsend, her life at court would be over. Finally, Margaret agreed to put out a statement.
Princess Margaret's personal message began with these words. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend.
The announcement revealed that both the Queen and her aides believed royal duty always had to come first.
She says, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others.
Margaret had been made to realise her privileged life inside the palace meant more to her than her love for Townsend. Buckingham Palace's old guard had won the battle with Margaret, but they were soon to face another fight. This time they'd be taking on the Queen's husband, and the battle would nearly split the palace apart. Buckingham Palace was now home to a new Queen and a new family. Into the palace came Elizabeth's 2 young children, Charles and Anne, and her husband of 4 years, Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. 31-year-old Philip was a commander in the Navy. He was used to being in charge. As a new arrival at the palace, Philip wanted to change things.
When he first moved into Buckingham Palace, he found that his mother-in-law, the Queen Mother, was still in residence. She was due to go down the Mall and live in Clarence House, but she said, no, I won't stay here. Clarence House is too small for me. And Philip smelt a rat. He felt that she wanted to pull her daughter's strings, and he didn't feel it right that the Queen Mother should be whispering in her daughter's ear day in, day out.
There was a considerable tension inside the family because Queen Elizabeth II had always deferred to her mother. Mummy's wishes must be gratified, and all of a sudden she was now married to this rather thrusting, aggressive prince, and Mummy was relegated to the sidelines. So it wasn't an entirely happy situation, and insiders talked about the mother-in-law from hell.
Christopher Wilson believes Philip had a drastic solution.
It was a cold winter, and he just ordered the servants to switch off the central heating in the Queen Mother's rooms, and she was gone in a week.
But even when she was no longer living in the palace, the Queen Mother still managed to keep her grip on the Queen.
At 9:30 every day, the Queen Mother would telephone her daughter to tell her what she thought was her duties for the day, what she should do. So that's an amazing amount of power for the Dowager Queen. Sometimes the Queen didn't obey her, but sometimes she did.
Philip seemed to want to make his mark somehow, so he turned his attention to the old-fashioned way the palace household was run.
He thinks the palace needs some organisation. Things have been done a certain way all along the years, and perhaps they should be changed. This is a man from naval background. He's expecting things to be run with precision.
To communicate between royal personages, you wrote out a little note. If a footman arrived with a silver platter, took the note on the silver platter and proceeded down to the recipient. He found this completely absurd.
Philip engages in an audit of the palace. What he does is he goes around and he says to every servant and courtier, what do you do? So he can write it all down and say to himself, there are 3 people doing the same job. This is not practical, this is not efficient.
Philip wanted to do more than reorganise the servants. It seemed to many he had ambitions to be involved at the highest royal level, even perhaps ruling alongside the Queen. The old-school royal aides were horrified at this upstart. They did their best to sideline Philip.
So often he would find courtiers carefully shutting the door in his face. He was told that he would not have access to state papers. He was told that he must not discuss matters of state with his wife, and that what he should do is put on a uniform and smile and wave at the crowds. He is being looked at snootily by a load of old guard courtiers.
Buckingham Palace became a suffocating and boring place for Philip. He took refuge with a club of high rollers who met every Thursday at a restaurant in Soho. The group included film stars like David Niven and Peter Ustinov.
They talked and they drank and they ate, and it was a time really for him to be young again and to celebrate with his friends, because in the palace you have to watch what you say, you have to be very careful. He could be free, he could be open, he could talk.
naked showgirls were talked about. I don't know whether they really did appear, but at any rate, it was a kind of escape valve as far as he was concerned. He got out of the Buckingham Palace and they behaved like playboys and so on in the world outside the confines of the palace itself.
One member, Baron Nahum, was famous for his wild parties, which Philip was rumoured to attend.
Queen Elizabeth was obviously perturbed about his activities, particularly when he came back from the Thursday Club in an elevated state and smelling of port.
But worse was to come. Royal aides panicked as rumours grew about Philip having affairs. The affairs were denied and there was no evidence, but rumours persisted. Action was needed. In 1956, the Queen was advised to let Philip go away on a long overseas tour, which should keep him out of trouble.
I think when he went away, you might almost say that the royal marriage was on the rocks.
Philip's absence from home was pounced on by the press. They found out he'd ordered a single bed. The Queen was forced to issue a denial of any marriage split.
Questions started to be asked in the press and also in the House of Commons. Where is the Queen's husband? And who is he with on board? And at that point, the Royal Yacht Britannia was turned around very smart and it was brought back to England. And indeed, by the time he came back, he'd made a deal with himself to make the marriage work.
Deal or not, the questions subsided and Philip would now walk 3 paces behind his wife. With their relationship now appearing to bloom, the couple went on to have 2 more children, Andrew and Edward. During the 1960s, the Queen's 4 children were growing up inside the stuffy, old-fashioned drawing rooms of Buckingham Palace. But outside the palace, it was becoming a very different world. People were rebelling. The old rules were being broken. In 1969, the winds of change finally blew into the palace. The Queen allowed a film to be made about the family's day-to-day life behind palace walls.
Prince Philip in particular was convinced that this was a good way of bridging the gap between the palace and the people. It was a royal commercial.
The documentary was a royal first. Cameras had never before been allowed behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace.
That documentary really did transform the relations. Well, it was for the first time that they saw the royal family, they saw them having breakfast, they saw them having picnics, as they are at home.
The BBC film was watched by 37 million people, eager to see what life was really like inside the palace. But the more the royal family was seen, the more they could be criticised. The film revealed a family living in a rather strange, old-fashioned but lavish world of their own. The Queen has made sure the film has never been shown again.
Publicity is a two-way street. If you can have a commercial, you can also have a knocking piece.
The royals' high profile means they've always been vulnerable, but not just to criticism. They've become targets in other ways too. In the early 70s, an heir to the throne was the victim of a shockingly violent attack. March 1974. There was an audacious kidnap attempt right outside Buckingham Palace. On the day of the attack, Princess Anne was approaching the palace gates in her royal car. With her was her personal bodyguard, Jim Beaton.
Driving up the Mall, we just got past Clarence House when a white car pulled in front of us, causing the chauffeur to stop. I saw the chap get out of the car and come back towards the royal car. So I got out and he was standing alongside the chauffeur's door. And he fired a couple of shots, and one went into my shoulder.
Even though he was wounded, Beaton managed to draw his pistol.
I tried to fire a shot in his direction, and the gun jammed. He said, "Put down your gun or I'll shoot." So I put my gun down.
Beaton, now unarmed, was still determined to protect Princess Anne.
I managed to get back into the car. I looked up and saw that he'd pointing his gun back into the car. So I just put my right hand up in front of it. He fired and it went into my hand. And I got this idea that we'll let the door go and I'll kick it and it'll hit him. It fired again and the bullet went into my abdomen. So that was more or less it for me, really.
Anne was only rescued by the bravery of a passing stranger, a former boxer, who ran at the gunman, punching him in the head. A policeman gave chase, and he was caught. His name was Ian Ball, and he was sent to Broadmoor. The extraordinary evidence in his car showed the full extent of his plans.
There was a typewritten ransom note addressed to the Queen. It demanded £1 million be raised. Ball wanted that money in used £5 notes in a bag, and most extraordinary perhaps of all, his demand quite specifically said that he wanted the Queen to deliver this ransom herself.
Ball had nearly got away with a royal kidnap right outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. But even after this shock, security was not prioritised. The royal family thought they were safe behind the palace walls. But in 1982, there was another massive security lapse. Michael Fagan was arrested for breaking into Buckingham Palace and getting as far as the Queen's bedroom.
Michael Fagan climbed through an open window and into an anteroom in the private apartments.
Even more alarming, after his arrest, Fagan revealed this wasn't his first visit to the palace. He'd successfully broken into Buckingham Palace before.
Fagan was a bit of a chump, really. He wasn't a master criminal, but one of his strengths was that he was very agile. In fact, he was a good old-fashioned cat burglar.
On his first break-in, Fagan had shinned up the palace drainpipes, heading for an open window. He got in undetected and roamed the palace freely for over an hour. His journey around the palace had begun at a window above the ambassador's entrance, and he then wandered the length of the palace from throne room to corgi room.
He had no specific intent at all. There was no plan. He was just fascinated. So, what does any visitor to Buckingham Palace do? They want to see the throne room, don't they? To see what it feels like to sit in the royal throne. Now I've done that, now so what else shall I do? Wanders around a bit more and he finds rooms that belong to Prince Charles. There's a bottle of Californian white wine there, and he chugs down the wine. He said to me, I'm actually, starting to feel a bit of pressure on my bladder. I need to urinate somewhere. He finds himself in an area used by the royal corgis, and he picks up a drinking bowl. He said, I use that as an emergency receptacle before making his leave.
Bolstered by his success, 1 month later, Fagan was back. This time, he was determined to see the Queen.
By now, he sort of knew the ropes around the palace, and he knew that all the members of the royal household actually had nameplates on their apartments. And sure enough, he'd only got a short distance along this corridor when he saw a sign on the door saying, Her Majesty the Queen. He let himself into the apartment. There she was. There was the Queen, fast asleep in bed. Wasn't quite sure what to do next, so he sat on the end of the bed. The Queen suddenly sat up in bed and apparently said to him, Who are you?
The Queen raised the alarm and Fagan was arrested and sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Palace security was clearly embarrassingly bad. Money was thrown at the problem, and still is. Today, the government spends an estimated £100 million a year on royal security. But all the policing and barbed wire fences in the world couldn't have stopped the next threat to the palace: the catastrophic marriage of the heir to the throne. Throughout the Queen's reign, Buckingham Palace has remained a family home. In the 70s, the heir to the throne, Prince Charles, lived there. He had a suite of rooms on the second floor overlooking the Mall. In his 20s, Charles was widely regarded as Britain's most eligible bachelor, and he brought back a steady stream of girlfriends to the palace.
Prince Charles was an absolute heartthrob. There's a famous set of photos of him attempting a swim on Bondi Beach and these sort of nubile Australians throwing themselves at him.
With media interest in Charles growing, a professional journalist was brought into the palace press office for the first time. Ron Allison had been a former BBC royal correspondent.
Pretty well every day of my life at the palace, I was asked in some shape or form or another the question about who Prince Charles was going to marry, to comment on a story or a rumour that he was going to marry Miss X, Lady Y or Princess Z.
There was even a rather ludicrous attempt, probably invented by the media, to pair him off with Richard Nixon's daughter at the time when Nixon was in the White House.
Charles did have to find a wife and produce an heir, but pushing him into marriage was to wreak havoc behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. Palace insiders had fixed ideas about who Charles should marry. They wanted a girl with no sexual history, a virgin. So Charles ditched his old girlfriends in favour of a shy 19-year-old nursery worker, Lady Diana Spencer. 750 million people watched their iconic kiss on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Overnight, Diana became the world's biggest celebrity, causing unease at a very high level. Dickie Arbiter was a member of the palace press team in the 1980s.
I'm not saying that Charles was jealous, but I think he was getting pretty angry that here was this sort of adulation for somebody new to the royal family, and here he was, he'd been around for years, doing good things, and it's bound to have an effect.
The royal family's mistrust of Diana grew. The way she ran her household in Kensington Palace was in sharp contrast to the big house up the road. Her personal bodyguard, Ken Wharf, saw the differences.
Buckingham Palace was very much run on the traditional style, which was served by this sort of mass of flunkies that would literally, on a 24-hour basis, sort of just rise from the basement to serve their master. It was a much more freer, relaxed atmosphere at Kensington Palace, simply because the Princess of Wales was quite different from other members of the royal family. I mean, she was, without doubt, a modernizer, would find it not difficult to speak in one breath to her private secretary and the next breath her Filipino cleaner. The Prince of Wales would find it quite difficult when Diana would sit in the kitchen and sit on the deep freeze chest and chat to the chef eating a bowl of cornflakes. He couldn't work that out.
Diana brought her different style into Buckingham Palace itself. She told Ken Wharf of a discussion about royal duties she'd had with the Queen.
Diana had this idea in the late 80s of working towards more money for the research into AIDS and HIV. Now, when she mentioned this to the Queen, well, the Queen's reaction was, well, why do you want to get involved in that? Why didn't you do something nice, like go to more fetes, open up shopping centres? Well, Diana said, well, I've done that. I want to do something more. I want to do something as a member of the royal family that can actually change the lives of a lot of people. Well, that didn't go down too well.
Diana increasingly did not fit into Buckingham Palace. She later spoke of frosty family meals in the palace dining room.
She says the Queen Mother keeps looking at her, and then when she, Diana, looks up from her dinner plate, the Queen Mother looks away. And she says it's kind of, it's almost interest mixed with pity. They couldn't quite understand where she was at.
Hidden behind the palace walls, the relationship between Charles and Diana was steadily falling apart.
Sometimes it was extremely difficult. Sometimes you've got to talk to them and say, you know, let's put on a good show. What you do behind closed doors is your business, but we're up front. This is showtime. Let's behave as if it's showtime.
In 1992, the full scope of palace tensions was revealed in Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story. Its publication sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. A huge number of intimate details about life behind closed doors made palace officials suspicious.
The whole book reeked of cooperation because there was too much that was too close to the bone. And I did ask her, I said, suggestions that you might have helped Andrew Morton write his book. She said, well, is that absolute nonsense? And she denied it. I said, so you had nothing to do with it? She said, absolutely. I knew she was lying, but you can't tell a member of the royal family that they're lying.
It really was a bombshell, kind of tsunami inside the palace, because one of the Windsor stocks in trade had been, ever since George V, that this was a happy family monarchy. And now, all of a sudden, it wasn't just an unhappy family, it was a vicious, brutal, Civil War-prone family.
By the end of 1992, it was as if Buckingham Palace was home to a seedy family soap opera. The royals were becoming increasingly unpopular. They fear being disliked. It can lead to questions about their very existence.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
Charles and Diana had separated. Two of the Queen's other children had announced their broken marriages. On top of that, Windsor Castle went up in flames. The fire was to bring about an extraordinary change in the life of Buckingham Palace. The government promised millions of pounds to cover the repairs, but the public questioned why they should be funding the Queen's second home as well as Buckingham Palace.
The Queen was pilloried for the next 2 weeks about government paying for it, suggesting that she lives there, she should pay for it.
People genuinely were upset. They were phoning radio phone-in programs, TV programs, bombarding newspapers, and in fact, convincing newspapers that this was a major issue here, and that why should the taxpayer at a time of recession be paying for repairs to a castle that they can't visit, that they don't use, and that is lived in by the royal family. The Queen was widely seen as the richest woman in the country. Surely she could pay for her damage to her own home.
In a bid to turn things around, it was announced that Buckingham Palace would open to the public for the first time. The money raised would pay for Windsor Castle repairs.
Hundreds of tourists queued overnight for their first ever glimpse inside the palace. It was far from a sellout, only half the available tickets sold today. £8 tickets, perhaps too dear for some, took them past the palace gates, the doors opening at 9:30 to allow the general public an historic view of such splendours as the grand staircase leading to the throne room.
Opening the palace for 2 months a year may have helped solve the Windsor problem, but that was all. Even Charles and Diana's divorce did not resolve the bitter war going on between them. The royal family's relationship with the public was stretched to breaking point in 1997, in the final act of the Diana story.
This is what's left of the Mercedes in which the Princess of Wales and her companion Dodi Al Fayed were being driven back to his house.
During the aftermath of Diana's death, Buckingham Palace was to play a defining role.
Britain seemed paralysed. Normal life seemed to be suspended. People didn't go into work. They came to Kensington Palace or Buckingham Palace. They signed the books of condolences, or they came and stood. And so many people were in tears.
The crowds gathering at the gates of Buckingham Palace wanted a reaction to Diana's death from the royal family. But nothing came. The palace was empty. The Queen was on her annual summer break at Balmoral.
Somehow they weren't acknowledging her. And it was almost as if, they were treating her in death as they had largely treated her in life, as a sort of a non-person.
Buckingham Palace became a target for public anger. There was no flag flying at half-mast. To the outside world, the Queen seemed not to care.
She completely misjudged the public mood. And it was one of the few times in her reign when she was actually subjected to public criticism.
They're the most cold people on this earth. And if I could actually see them and speak to them, I would really tell them what I thought. In fact, I would probably be fastened away in the tower forever.
So, rather quickly, she made a whole series of concessions. She came down to London, the flag was flown at half-mast, she walked up and down this extraordinary array of flowers.
On the eve of Diana's funeral, crowds massed in the Mall. The Queen was to make a live broadcast to the nation from the palace.
What I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself.
The Queen's aides deliberately used Buckingham Palace's position in the broadcast so the crowds could be seen through the palace windows behind her.
I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others.
She was acknowledging, if you like, that she understood why all these people had come to her home, to come to Buckingham Palace to pay tribute to Diana.
The following day, the palace staged a grand state funeral for Diana, watched by 2 billion people around the globe. Buckingham Palace had become a focus for the nation's grief. The Queen's broadcast had worked, and the royal family had finally shown enough public emotion to satisfy the crowds. Public hostility towards her subsided. After Diana's death, the family retreated behind palace walls. They knew they had to regain their popularity, and in their fight back, the palace itself was to prove one of their best weapons. The death of Diana had thrown a harsh light on Buckingham Palace. The emotion and the flowers at its gates seemed a complete contrast to the remote family behind its walls. The royals were seen as out of touch with the rest of Britain. Change was needed. Like Edward VII a century earlier, the royal family turned to the palace itself for inspiration. In the 2002 Golden Jubilee celebrations, the palace was given a central role. In a bid to regain the nation's affection, the grounds were opened up to a pop concert for the first time ever. Headlining was some of the biggest names from British rock.
This, in a sense, was part of a kind of a PR operation. You know, the Queen had been through difficult times. The palace had been through the whole Diana thing. And I think in a lot of people's minds, the palace was rather remote. And there was this feeling that royalty really weren't in touch with the public. So this was part of an attempt to bring things together, consciously, and in a nice way, I think.
On the day of the concert, 12,000 ticket holders poured into the palace gardens.
About half an hour before we were due to go on the air live, I couldn't hear the orchestra. That wire had gone wrong. And I remember saying to someone, well, we need a new wire. And they went, well, we need permission from the palace to run another wire up here. And I went, it's half an hour's time. Get that wire. So eventually I could hear them, they could hear me, and it happened live. And it was a stupendous feeling, I'm going to say. I did feel that we achieved what we set out to do, and it was on the front of every paper the next day. And for a moment, there was such a great feeling in the country. It was like, yes, we did this, and we have come together.
A few years later, Brian May was welcomed back to Buckingham Palace at a reception to celebrate the British music industry.
I said, good evening, Mum, or something, and I said, I'm the guy who made that terrible noise on your roof. I hope I didn't disturb you. And she smiled and she said, oh, it was you, was it? So I introduced her to Clapton and to Jeff Beck and to Jimmy Page. And she said to Eric Clapton, oh, how long have you been playing then? And he said, quite a while, really, Mum.
The PR offensive around the palace continued with more receptions and more TV cameras let inside. In 2006, the gardens were excavated on live TV when Tony Robinson's team filmed at the palace. The actor in him recognised a place well versed in putting on a show.
There's no doubt that Buckingham Palace is very artfully stage managed. There's doors that you can't open, and I tried. There's doors that if you do open, someone will very respectfully say, actually, that's not a room that we would like you to go into. You've got that grand, eloquent sweep of staircase. You've got this glorious ballroom. But you've only got to go a few paces in any direction and you'll come across tiny, pokey little rooms that look like something you'd find in a terraced house from the 1890s. Buckingham Palace is for show, it's theatre. So essentially all you need is a well-maintained exterior and slap bang in the middle of it, a few grand rooms.
The Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012 showed Buckingham Palace had become the perfect stage for the monarchy. 1 million people massed in front of it to take part in the celebrations. It was as big a crowd as the palace had seen in its entire history. The plan, started 100 years ago by Edward VII to use Buckingham Palace as a splendid royal theatre, had completely succeeded. But the palace may be near the end of that phase of its life. The building's not stood the test of time. Its walls are crumbling and its fabulous facade is coming apart.
Money was never properly spent on it, and it certainly seems to be falling apart. At the moment, it hasn't been properly rewired, and its plumbing is all hopeless.
In recent times, we've heard about ceilings falling down, pipes bursting, and bits of masonry falling off and narrowly hitting Princess Anne.
The whole thing needs an overhaul, and that's a big and very expensive job. And it's such an expensive job that no monarch really wants to see it happen on their watch.
£150 million is needed for Buckingham Palace repairs. To find the money, the palace could be made more genuinely open to public view, rather than much of it kept private as a royal residence. Buckingham Palace is not owned by the Queen herself. She is simply its most celebrated tenant. Once the Queen's extraordinarily long reign comes to an end, its future could be up for grabs, an opportunity the incoming king may welcome.
There are many people around Charles who say that he does not want to move in there. He has a very lovely setup in this complex that consists of Clarence House and St James's Palace. They're much more beautiful buildings, they're in better condition, they're smaller.
Under Charles's plans, Buckingham Palace would no longer be a royal home for the first time in almost 200 years.
He would like to turn the palace into some sort of building at the end of the Mall, which is open to the public. It could be the office of the monarch. I know he would like to see the Mall effectively paved over. It should become a pedestrian walkway so he could walk from Trafalgar Square all the way up to Buckingham Palace, and to be able to walk around the property. It would give it a more, he feels, a more inclusive feeling.
The palace could have a new lease of life, as could the royals themselves. Living in less grand surroundings, no longer on constant show, they might not seem so set apart from the rest of us. The next 60 years could bring in a new era for the palace, without its royal residence.
History is all about change. Buckingham Palace has only been Buck Pal in the way that we know it for 100 years. There's no reason why it shouldn't change. The idea that you can't change Buckingham Palace because it's historic is absurd and makes no sense.
Buckingham Palace has been a private, secret world of its own for more than a century. With its doors unlocked, it could become a spectacular people's palace, open to the nation. Buckingham Palace is a place of intrigue, a grand and closed building that fascinates like few others on Earth. It combines three crucial roles which make it unique. It's a family home, an office of state, and Britain's national stage for pomp and ceremony. The first of these is perhaps the most famous. Every year, millions of tourists flock to the home of the British royals, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Queen. But inside the palace, the Queen's bedroom is far from the Mall, keeping her safely out of sight. Princess Anne and Prince Andrew aren't so lucky. Their rooms are at the very front. Closer to the Queen's apartment is a room just for her corgis. But like all monarchs who have called this building home, the Queen doesn't enjoy life at the palace.
Nobody can enjoy living in Buckingham Palace because you can't make a cosy home of it. It's not that sort of place. It's more a working organisation.
This is because of Buckingham Palace's second role. It is the monarch's office and the workplace of the royal household, a staff of hundreds of cooks, valets, pages and servants, many with bewildering job titles.
It's the Lord Chamberlain and the Lord Steward, the rat-catcher in ordinary of the old days, the crown equerry, page of the present, the clockwinder, the keeper of the privy purse, the page of the back stairs.
This aristocratic style of service has changed little in over 200 years and is organised in a strict hierarchy. The palace itself is even colour-coded to maintain the pecking order.
You have the sort of red carpet area and the sort of the green carpet area. So, you know, you don't normally, as an employee, step on the red carpet.
This vast entourage of servants waits on the royals and also services Buckingham Palace's third role as a place of ceremony and pomp. The glitz of its state banquets helps grease the wheels of international agreements and trade, while knighthoods and OBEs reward the nation's high achievers, from captains of industry to lollipop ladies and even celebrities. The palace has become the place the public can aspire to being invited, if only to meet some of the most famous faces in the world.
I think one of the most interesting things about the British monarchy in the last few decades is how it's become part of the celebrity culture. Our Queen and her family are the biggest A-list celebs we've got.
Even the building itself seems to have taken on a celebrity role. The word palace has become shorthand for everything that the royals think and do.
It's become so synonymous with the monarch, both in Britain and worldwide, that actually to many people, Buckingham Palace is the monarchy.
Yet, there was never meant to be a royal house here, let alone a palace. The original Buckingham House was a U-shaped mansion set in parkland, the vision of poet and politician, the Duke of Buckingham. In 1761, George III bought it as a private house for his wife, Queen Charlotte, for just £5 million in today's money. But it wasn't until 1837 that it became the residence of a monarch, although it was far from being an ideal royal home.
Queen Victoria moved into the palace, but didn't really like it very much, thought it was cold, drafty and practical.
Victoria and her husband Albert employed the period's top architect, Edward Blore, to make the palace more homely.
Queen Victoria needed more space for her 9 children and their nursery requirements, and she got Edward Blore to build this huge wing that is actually the frontage of the palace that we see today.
With the extension completed, Victoria, Albert and their 9 children settled into life at Buckingham Palace. But in 1861, its role as a family home came to a sudden end. Aged just 42, Albert died. A grief-stricken Victoria couldn't bear to be in Buckingham Palace any longer. She fled to Windsor Castle. Over the next 40 years, the public would hardly see her, and many began to ask if the country needed a monarchy at all. By the time of her death in 1901, the future of the royal family was far from secure, and Buckingham Palace was deserted. But Victoria's eldest son had a grand plan to save the monarchy, and the palace his mother had abandoned was the key.
The person who turned Buckingham Palace into a fabulous fandango of monarchy, well, that was Edward VII.
But the effort would almost kill him. Today, Buckingham Palace is one of the most iconic buildings in the world, famous as the home of the royal family. But this building only became the centre of British royal life just over 100 years ago. The transformation was down to one monarch, Edward VII, the royal showman.
He looked like a king. He was only 5'6", but he was every inch a king, and he loved appearing in all his finery and strutting along the stage that he had created for himself.
But when Edward came to the throne in 1901, he faced a massive problem. For the previous 40 years, his mother, Queen Victoria, had rarely been seen in public. People were questioning why the monarchy existed. Edward saw it as his duty to rescue the crown, and Buckingham Palace was central to his plans. But in many ways, he was an unlikely saviour.
He was nicknamed Edward the Caresser because of his reputation as a philanderer.
Edward, or Bertie as he was known in the family, knew the public loved a show, and he saw Buckingham Palace as his ideal stage.
One of the first things he was really determined to do was to bring the monarchy to London and make Buckingham Palace the headquarters of the monarchy, make it visible.
Edward's Buckingham Palace was to be a statement, a permanent and grandiose reminder that this country had a monarchy. But the building he inherited was dark, dusty, and run down.
He described the palace as being a kind of mausoleum. There were rooms covered in dust sheets. There were endless sculptures of Victoria's dead dogs.
Traditionally, a new monarch does nothing for the first few months of their reign as a sign of mourning for their predecessor. But Edward went around the palace destroying all the remnants of his mother's rule. Edward redecorated the palace in a blaze of white and gold, basing the style on the hippest hotels and theatres in London.
He turned the palace into a reflection of his own passion for grandeur, for pomp, for excess.
The look was so regal it still adorns the grandest part of Buckingham Palace, the ballroom, to this day. He drew up plans to widen the road leading to the building, the Mall, and to install a grand arch at its far end. In front of the palace, he'd erect a golden-topped statue to his dead mother. But before he could implement his grand plan, Edward's dreams were placed in grave jeopardy.
He sits up really late at night every night reading through, very, very conscientiously, through all the government red boxes, all the government paper that comes to him. And basically it's all too much. And his reaction, being the kind of person he was to eat too much.
He used to have huge meals, an enormous breakfast with cold grouse, ham, kedgeree, kidneys, 14-course dinners, 12-course lunches, and probably half a cold chicken left by his bed at night.
With the building work barely underway, the king was struck down by intense abdominal pains. The only option was surgery.
The chief worry about this operation was that the king's incredibly painful abdomen was the result of stomach cancer.
Edward's dressing room in Buckingham Palace became an emergency operating theatre. Invasive surgery was in its infancy. the risks were huge.
When the surgeon first starts operating and he pushes his knife through many inches of fat in the king's tummy, he finds something hard and he thinks, oh my God, this is cancer. And then he sort of pokes it with his knife and it's an abscess, and out comes about a pint of pus.
If the abscess had burst inside him, the king would have died from blood poisoning. Instead, the next day, Bertie was sitting up in bed, smoking a cigar. The king seized his reprieve with vigour. He moved in his wife and 4 children, making Buckingham Palace the home of the royal family. He began entertaining his mistresses in the building and made the palace the centre of London society. From his regal stage, Bertie thrilled his people with his huge gusto for life.
He loved good food and drink, he liked pretty ladies, and he liked to flutter on the racecourse. And that's exactly what the average man would have done if he'd had the chance. And so there were always great cries of good old Teddy when he appeared.
But good old Teddy was not a well man. Aged 68, he was struck down by severe bronchitis and confined to the palace. After just 9 years on the throne, Edward died in the building that he saw as pivotal to reviving the monarchy. He had achieved his goal of creating a palace in the heart of London, and the huge crowds who gathered outside for his funeral showed the royal family was popular once again.
Edward VII's death created a tremendous wave of sorrow. There was enormous mourning everywhere. Women even used to thread their underclothes with black ribbon, and cab drivers tied black ribbon round their whips.
Edward would be a tough act to follow. The honour passed to his oldest son, George. The quarter of a century he ruled would be one of the most tumultuous and bloody Britain had ever seen. And the sovereignty of the country and the future of the palace would once again come under threat. But George had few of the attributes that had made his father so successful.
George V was the biggest contrast you could imagine to Edward VII. He was responsible, dutiful, and actually a little bit dull.
But there was one thing George did share with his charismatic father: a passion for Buckingham Palace. He achieved Edward's vision of Admiralty Arch and unveiled the Victoria Memorial. Then he put his own mark on the building.
The hideous facade that existed was like an old Victorian railway station, covered in dirty smog. It looked unattractive and very, very unappealing. It didn't give a sense of kingship, of monarchy, of the centre of the empire.
George clad the exterior with a new facade of dazzling white Portland stone. London now had an imposing royal presence, the like of which hadn't been seen since the time of Henry VIII. There was dramatic change too behind the closed doors of the palace. George believed womanising like his father could lead to public resentment and threaten the family's future.
He actually said, "The only wife I'm interested in is my own." He collected stamps, not mistresses.
His sense of duty was to serve the palace well during one of the darkest periods in British history. On the 4th of August 1914, the King met with his government inside Buckingham Palace to discuss Germany's invasion of Belgium. Hours later, George declared war to cheers of "God Save the King" from the thousands gathered outside the palace. But George was unsure what his role as a wartime king should be.
He is, of course, in honorary terms, head of the army and the navy, but he is not playing an active role in deciding war strategy or going to the front. And so what should he do? He's got to stay behind in Britain. What is his role in Britain?
At home in the palace, he took to wearing military uniform. He became a cheerleader for the fight against the Boche and visited hospitals filled with the injured and dying.
They are getting out and meeting people in a way which was completely unprecedented. I mean, before that, monarchs had got into a big car and driven around, but now suddenly they are getting out of that car, shaking people's hands.
George had invented the idea that kings and queens had a duty to their people. It set the tone that's endured right up to today's young royals. Despite these efforts, in 1917, the secure world inside Buckingham Palace came under threat. Across the country, public disorder was breaking out.
There was huge waves of anti-German feeling throughout the war, so much so that shops with German names had their windows broken. I mean, even things like Dachshunds, dogs were kicked, and German Shepherds were renamed Alsatians.
George's grandfather, Prince Albert, was German. So the royal family name was the very Germanic Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. People openly questioned why the country had a German as king. But inside the palace, one man had a simple solution. Lord Stamfordham was the Alistair Campbell of his day. His plan? Change the name to something that combined both royalty and Britishness. Windsor. This simple name change appeased the public, and Buckingham Palace's future seemed secure. But events further afield would prove to be an even greater challenge for the palace's top advisor. In Russia, a popular uprising had overthrown their emperor, the Tsar, and the government was keen to get him out of the country as quickly as possible.
They approach the British government and say, please, will you give the Tsar asylum? And the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, says, yes, we will. But clearly we need the agreement of the King.
Their Royal Highnesses, King George and Tsar Nicholas, were cousins and had been close friends since childhood. But in Buckingham Palace, Stamfordham spotted danger.
He has his own intelligence sources, which suggest to him that there is quite significant Republican feeling in Britain, and that if the Tsar is brought to England, this would cause, inflame Republican feeling and endanger the position of the monarchy.
Stamfordham convinced a reluctant king that the risk was too great. He had to say no. Instead of finding sanctuary in Buckingham Palace, the Tsar and his family were taken into a Siberian basement and shot. George had condemned his cousin to death, but Stamfordham's advice had helped secure the future of the monarchy. And in 1917, he suggested an innovation, an honours system, which connected Buckingham Palace to the public like never before.
There was no doubt that the British Empire depended upon the huge amount of graft that was given by all ranks of society to win the war. And the King was advised to embrace that in the Order of the British Empire in 1917. It was a way for the first time that the monarchy could congratulate anyone of whatever social rank for their contribution to the Great War effort.
The invention of this new honours system meant Buckingham Palace welcomed munitions workers, trade union officials, and even women, with the pageantry previously reserved only for the upper classes.
It creates this sense of that the palace is something you can aspire to. It's a place where you go to receive your decoration. There's this direct link between the monarch and the palace and the people.
When Germany finally admitted defeat on the 11th of November 1918, there was only one place the people wanted to gather. Thousands descended on the palace to chant the king's name. The Great War had cost the lives of over 17 million people. The monarchies of Germany, Russia and Austro-Hungary had perished. Yet the newly named Windsors had emerged not only unscathed, but with credit. But by the mid-1930s, George V's health was failing. More and more of the king's duties were handed to his oldest son, Edward.
Edward in the 1920s and 30s was like Princess Diana. He was incredibly glamorous. He was brave. He had gone to the front in World War I. He'd served in the trenches, and he dressed beautifully.
But Edward was a playboy, and his affair with Wallis Simpson would threaten to undo all his father's good work and plunge Buckingham Palace into its darkest hour. In the early 20th century, George V had transformed Buckingham Palace, handing out OBEs and CBEs for gallantry and service had connected the palace to the people like never before, while George's own sense of duty and family values had made him a popular monarch. But his eldest son, Edward, didn't subscribe to this way of life. He was still single, and in 1934 he invited his latest lover to a party at the palace. Wallis Simpson represented everything King George hated.
Here you have an American divorcee. American we don't like, divorcee we absolutely do not like, and we do not have women like that in our court.
The King, George V, was pretty outraged. This woman in my house. And don't forget, this was the time when, as a divorcee, you wouldn't be invited to a royal garden party, let alone to a ball at Buckingham Palace.
Edward was besotted with Wallis. Soon this controversial relationship would threaten life at Buckingham Palace and the stability of the whole country. In early 1936, King George V was struck down with pleurisy. And on the 21st of January, the palace announced that he'd died. Edward was now king, and it wasn't a role he took too readily.
Edward VIII hated Buckingham Palace. He felt a prisoner there, and on one famous occasion, he actually jumped out of a window to avoid his private secretary, Harding, and went off to canoodle with Mrs. Simpson.
As king, he thought he was free to do what he wanted. He cut the pay of palace staff whilst lavishing jewels and furs on his mistress. He was outspoken on questions of politics, entirely at odds with his role as a monarch. And his habit of revealing national secrets to Wallis made him a security risk. So MI5 bugged phones at Buckingham Palace and started a campaign to undermine the king's mistress.
The people who were employed by MI5 were usually deadbeats who would go to the pub and make it up. They went out of their way to discover what she'd done during a period in her life when she was in China, and they came up with the story that she had learned enhanced sexual techniques in a brothel in Shanghai. Not true.
While the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, openly described King Edward as an abnormal being, half child, half genius. On the 16th of November 1936, Edward summoned Baldwin to Buckingham Palace to discuss a new development. He intended to make Wallis his queen.
The divorce proceedings had gone through. He was intent now on marrying Mrs. Simpson as soon as he could.
Shocked, Baldwin tore into the king. Edward was head of the Church of England, and they didn't allow marriage to divorcees. There could be no exception just because Edward was king. But Baldwin's arguments fell on deaf ears.
The king said if it was a choice between Mrs. Simpson and the throne, he was going to choose Mrs. Simpson.
Britain was teetering on the brink of crisis. Some blamed Baldwin for not finding a way for the king to marry. Others saw Wallis as the source of the problem. The king fled to the safety of Windsor Castle. And on the evening of the 11th of December 1936, he made a radio address to the nation.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love.
Edward had chosen Wallis over his duty to his country and his people.
If he was sacrificing duty to pleasure, didn't this invalidate the whole principle of monarchy?
It was left to Edward's younger brother, Albert, to convince a shocked public that they still needed a king. But Albert was far from a natural leader. He stammered and chain-smoked to soothe his brittle nerves.
He didn't have the glamour of his brother, but he had one thing that his brother had not got that gave him a huge cachet, and that was a wife and family. And that simply was what Edward VIII had failed to do: get married, have children, the most important job of a monarch.
Albert moved his family into Buckingham Palace. Here he would rely on the same sense of family values and duty which had made his father George V so popular. His biggest assets were his two daughters, 11-year-old Elizabeth and 6-year-old Margaret.
The adoration for Elizabeth and Margaret is overwhelming. The country loved them, the world loved them. They were so thrilled by these two princesses.
Just like in his father's and grandfather's day, inside the palace, the new royal family would be waited on by hundreds of servants. And as a big sign of continuity with his father, Albert changed his name to become George VI. To excite the nation about their new monarch, his coronation was a stage-managed piece of regal showmanship. Afterwards, the whole family appeared in all their finery on the palace's iconic balcony. For the two princesses, life would never be the same again. They now lived in a 700-room palace.
This huge playground of corridors, of drawing rooms, gigantic place that you could get lost in a moment.
Their parents decided that these heirs to the throne shouldn't attend school. Instead, they'd be taught privately in a room in the palace. With just each other for company, the schoolroom became the scene of frequent fights and squabbles. Margaret was a biter, and Elizabeth had a fearsome left hook. Of the two, Elizabeth was far more dedicated to her schoolwork, but even she tried to get out of lessons. To escape a French tutorial, the heir to the throne had tipped a bottle of ink over her own head. Margaret was more carefree, and she found Buckingham Palace was the ideal place for playing practical jokes.
One of Margaret's favourite tricks at the palace was with lime balls, the sweets. So what she used to do was she used to creep up behind the courtiers and she used to put sticky lime balls into their pockets when they weren't looking. And so, of course, when they put their hands into their pockets later, they come out with a whole handful of horrid, sticky, sugary stuff.
His fun-loving daughters compelled the king to make a change inside the palace. In the northwest corner, he converted a conservatory into a swimming pool, so the princesses could learn to swim in private. But events in Europe would soon break the idyll of palace life.
Sie wollten, Herr, kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Fascism was dragging the continent toward another bloody conflict, and many feared the king was far too weak to be the nation's cheerleader when war broke out.
Lloyd George said that George VI was a nitwit. Daladier, the French premier, said that he was a moron. His brother Edward, needless to say, said that he was a complete nincompoop.
But fortunately, in the palace, there was a figure who was up for the fight. The Queen knew she had to take the lead.
Everybody recognised that she was the star of the show. She was the iron in his backbone.
As the war progressed, the royals would need the Queen's steely determination like never before. In late 1940, Hitler launched the Blitz, a sustained aerial bombardment designed to bring London to its knees. And the Fuhrer saw Buckingham Palace as a key target. 16 bombs hit Buckingham Palace, one destroying the building's chapel. But Hitler's plan backfired. Despite the danger, the Queen and King refused to leave. Overnight, Buckingham Palace and its residents became potent symbols of British defiance. And the Queen was getting accolades from far and wide.
Hitler called the Queen the most dangerous woman in Europe. That's because he knew that she had this amazing propaganda power. The fact that she was there, the fact that the palace was there, it said, we are not going to give in.
The Queen took the King on visits to the bomb-ravaged East End to boost morale. And inside the palace, she readied herself for a possible German invasion.
She really turns Buckingham Palace into a shooting range, and she practices on the rats that are running around in the rubble after the bombing, so that when the Germans come, she is ready to defend herself with a gun, and she's going to shoot them.
Then, in May 1941, the bombing eased. The Blitz had failed, and the fear of invasion began to recede. Buckingham Palace had not only survived the bombardment, but emerged with credit. In 1943, the Queen's niece, Margaret Rhodes, got a job working for MI6 and took a room in the palace. She found the staff and royals strictly observed rationing. It was seen as setting an example to the nation.
We ate our meals with the household, with the ladies-in-waiting and the secretaries and people. Every single pudding, every single day, was stewed plums from the garden, obviously.
But the royal household did have one advantage over most of the nation. They were free to supplement their rations with food from their estates.
On one occasion, there was some tummy trouble going around the palace, and Lascelles, the private secretary, attributed it to a surfeit of grouse. Well, which I think very few people in the rest of the country were suffering from.
The palace limited the number of logs on their open fires to save on resources, and boarded up windows to observe the blackout. But Margaret found that even in the height of wartime, there were standards to maintain.
Well, because we had no fridge, we put the bottles on the windowsill, which we thought would keep the milk slightly cooler. However, unfortunately, the master of the household got a view of the front of Buckingham Palace and said that we were defacing the facade of the palace by sticking our milk bottles on the windowsill in full view of the public. So we had told to jolly well stop doing that.
Suitably chastised, Margaret settled into the wartime routine at the palace. Although the building's security did interfere with her love life.
One went out sometimes with young men to nightclubs and things, and when they very gallantly said, "Can I see you home?" it was a little daunting because we had to get past a sentry and a policeman to get in. So it would rather put off the young men, I may say.
On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered. From the palace's famous balcony, the royals led the celebrations, while thousands crowded onto the Mall. The two princesses were allowed to go out and join the throng, and Margaret went along too.
I mean, it was just great fun. It was exciting. I mean, everybody was sort of kissing everybody and throwing their hats in the air, and it was sort of mayhem, you know. Enjoyable mayhem.
2 years later, the palace would once more take centre stage. Princess Elizabeth's marriage to Naval Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten was the cause of national celebration. But inside the palace, her choice of husband was causing waves.
They didn't like the idea of penniless Greek prince. They felt he was rough, ill-mannered, uneducated, and probably would not be faithful.
In post-war Britain, Buckingham Palace had found its place at the heart of the nation. It had been the scene of mass celebration when Germany surrendered in 1945. Just 2 years later, the palace was once more the focus of the nation's gaze for the marriage of Princess Elizabeth to Philip Mountbatten. The public lapped up the wedding with enthusiasm. But behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, the groom divided opinion.
He was incredibly good looking, and I think that probably the older members of the court thought he was a bit of an outsider.
Some courtiers saw Philip as not royal enough. But there was a bigger problem on the horizon: the influence of his scheming uncle, Lord Mountbatten.
Mountbatten was such a twister that one courtier said to him, "Mountbatten, if you swallowed a nail, you would shit a corkscrew."
Many in the palace saw Philip as a pawn in Mountbatten's quest to seize power.
He was very determined that the House of Mountbatten should rule Britain, not the House of Windsor.
In 1949, paranoia in the palace escalated to breaking point when King George VI became critically ill.
So here we have George VI, unwell, very unwell, and we need a regent. Now, the obvious candidate is Princess Elizabeth, his daughter.
As regent, Elizabeth would take charge until her father recovered or passed away. Fearing she would be too heavily influenced by her husband and Lord Mountbatten, some courtiers began discussing alternatives. In 2009, royal biographer Christopher Wilson chanced across a stash of letters in a Californian library. These revealed that one aristocrat had an alternative so outlandish it bordered on treason. The letters were written by Kenneth de Courcy.
Kenneth de Courcy was a cheat, a liar, a fraud. But the extraordinary thing was that in the 1940s, he occupied a rather unusual position in English society. He got all the latest gossip. People talked to him. He was a sort of Jeffrey Archer figure.
In his London club, de Courcy picked up on rumours of disquiet. He saw a chance to gain power and influence inside Buckingham Palace. He wrote to the exiled former King Edward VIII, now demoted to Duke of Windsor and married to Wallis.
I may tell you most confidentially that a regency has now already been discussed, and it seems likely enough that presently one will be appointed.
Living in France, Edward yearned to return home, and for his wife Wallis, this was the opportunity she'd been waiting for.
If she could come back to England and wear all those royal jewels and have people bow before her as the wife of the regent, that would be her ideal dream.
De Courcy went further. Once Edward was regent, he could block Elizabeth's route to the crown. Edward and Wallis could be king and queen.
It is treasonable. What De Courcy is suggesting is that the Duke batters his way back onto the throne.
But at the crucial moment, Edward dithered. Did he really want to give up his luxurious, carefree existence and return to stuffy Buckingham Palace to do a job he'd previously found dull and boring? As Edward procrastinated, George VI recovered. The moment had passed. Inside Buckingham Palace, the king welcomed his new granddaughter Anne into the world. But he would never return to full health. He lost a lung to cancer and appeared aged beyond his 56 years. And in February 1952, the inevitable happened.
The nation mourns a king who served it so well. He passed away peacefully in his sleep.
His elder daughter, Elizabeth, was propelled to the throne, where she remains to this day. Buckingham Palace has not always been a happy place during her record-breaking reign. But the palace itself has helped the royals through their darkest hours.
What I say to you now, as your queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart.
And emerged not just as the perfect royal stage, but a place for the nation to celebrate together. And while its role could change in the future, the palace will surely continue to be the symbol of everything British.